What if I told you that somewhere in the dusty corners of old archives, hidden beneath centuries of revisions, manipulations, and deliberate historical cleaning, there exists a blueprint of a world that modern history refuses to acknowledge? A world so vast, so interconnected, and so technologically advanced in its architectural thinking that every modern city would look like a child's sketch by comparison. A world where civilizations did not rise one after another in isolated pockets, but were instead provinces of one single mega-culture. A world that did not fall thousands of years ago, but collapsed far more recently, with ruins still fresh when the first modern scholars stumbled upon it. A world whose last surviving witness may have been a man we've been taught to see merely as an imaginative engraver, Giovanni Battista Piranesi. Imagine that you open an old book of engravings, expecting fantastical scenes, whimsical ruins, maybe some classical reinterpretations of Roman architecture. But instead, what you find feels more like an autopsy report of a dead world. You see cities too perfect to be fantasies, infrastructures too elaborate to be inventions, ruins too fresh to belong to the distant past. And woven throughout all of it is a symbolic language, a repeating architectural DNA that somehow appears in Rome, St. Petersburg, France, Vienna, Istanbul, and scattered across dozens of cities that supposedly belong to different cultures, eras, and empires. It is the kind of discovery that doesn't just raise questions, it detonates them.
This is the forbidden blueprint they don't want you to see. Because if Piranesi was not fantasizing, if he was documenting, if he was sketching the dying breaths of a global architectural empire, then the entire structure of our conventional timeline collapses. And the more you look, the more the cracks widen. The story begins where all revision begins, with ruins, but not the ruins we're used to, weathered stones, softened by thousands of years. No, Piranesi's ruins are sharp, violent, fresh. In some plates, partially decomposed skeletons still cling to archways, as though the disaster that killed them happened only years earlier. The 18th century artist who observed them was not looking at artifacts buried under 15 centuries of dust. He was sketching the crime scene of a recent cataclysm. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand the scale of what Piranesi may have witnessed, we have to start with one of his most unsettling engravings, one that millions have seen, but few have actually understood.
At first glance, it seems like a cityscape from someone's fever dream, a surreal metropolis where elements of Rome, St. Petersburg, and Egypt swirl together like fragments of different puzzles forced into one frame. There are rostral columns decorated with the prows of ships, identical to those in St. Petersburg. There are Egyptian obelisks guarded by 4 chained black figures known historically as Moors, motifs found in both Rome and Russia. There is a column that perfectly resembles the Alexander column in St. Petersburg, and an equestrian statue placed exactly where you'd expect such a monument in a European imperial square. The buildings themselves look Roman, yet the overall composition feels like a mirror image of St. Petersburg. The resemblance is so strong that many viewers assume the engraving must depict some fantasy version of the Russian city, but it doesn't. It is labeled as Rome, or rather, an imaginary Rome. That one word, imaginary, is how historians neatly dismiss the uncomfortable fact that too many elements of this fantasy city match real monuments in cities that supposedly did not even exist yet at the time Piranesi created his engravings. St. Petersburg, for example, was founded in 1703 and was still very young when Piranesi was active. How could he fantasize monuments that would only appear later? How could he draw a city square that looks uncannily like the future palace square decades before it was completed? Historians shrug and simply call it a coincidence, a whim, a capriccio. But if this is just imagination, then why do the same motifs appear again and again in his work? Why do the Moors reappear? Why the obelisks? Why the triumphal arches? Why the colossal vases that blend Egyptian cults with Greek architecture? Why the monstrous underground complexes that make no sense as prisons, yet match the scale and complexity of real structures buried under Istanbul, Rome, and parts of Europe? Coincidence does not repeat itself with mathematical precision. Coincidence does not form a language. Coincidence does not create a blueprint, unless it isn't coincidence at all. Maybe Piranesi wasn't inventing. Maybe he was recording. And maybe he was doing it with urgency, as though the world he sketched was disappearing faster than anyone could understand. To understand the magnitude of what Piranesi may have preserved, look closer at the details of his engravings. Look at the strange obsessive logic of repeating motifs that should not coexist if our history is accurate. Look at the mixture of Egyptian, Greek, and Roman architecture depicted not as a fantasy collage, but as a seamless, functioning, unified style.
Look at the machinery in his so-called prisons. The giant winches, pulleys, levers, and platforms that look like industrial infrastructure rather than punishment chambers. Why do Piranesi's prisons feel like cross-sections of underground megastructures, subway systems, hydraulic power plants, or subterranean factories? Why do they resemble the basilica cisterns of Istanbul, except larger, more complex, and more interconnected? And why, most importantly, do modern historians insist on calling them fantasies instead of even considering the possibility that Piranesi documented real colossal underground complexes that no longer fit the official narrative of history? Because once that door opens, everything starts falling apart. But the most damning piece of evidence may not be a prison or a ruin. It may be a vase. A single exquisitely detailed engraving of a classical vase that is supposedly Egyptian. But the vase is depicted inside a perfect Greek rotunda with Roman architectural details. The worshippers in the scene wear Greco-Roman clothing. The entire composition screams Hellenistic world. And in the center stands an ibis, the sacred Egyptian bird associated with Thoth. How can an Egyptian ritual be performed in a Greek temple? How can Greek clothing appear in an Egyptian scene? How can one artifact simultaneously reflect three civilizations separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years? The answer is simple. Unless it's not three civilizations. Unless it is one. One civilization with Egyptian religion, Greek philosophy, and Roman engineering not as separate chapters, but as parts of one global cultural system. One civilization whose provinces later became Egypt, Greece, and Rome in our rewritten textbooks. One megaculture that built unified architecture, shared symbols, and erected monumental cities across continents. This is the forbidden blueprint. And if that sounds far-fetched, consider this. When Piranesi engraved the ruins of ancient arches, he showed partially decomposed corpses still clinging to them. You can count the ribs. You can see the remaining flesh. In forensic terms, this suggests no more than a few years or decades have passed since death, not 15 centuries. If the Roman Empire collapsed in the distant past, how could Piranesi have sketched bodies that still had tissue?
Unless the fall of that world was not ancient, unless it was recent, unless the ruins of that megacity were still warm in the 1700s, could a global civilization have collapsed not in 476 AD, but sometime between the 1500s and 1700s? If so, who rewrote the dates? Who reassigned the ruins? Who rebranded temples, statues, and altars? Who decided that certain symbols had to be erased while others were inserted? For that, we turn to the altar of Santa Maria del Priorato, a church designed, at least partially, by Piranesi himself. The original design shows not a lamb, the Christian symbol of Christ, but a calf holding a two-barred cross, a symbol far older than Christianity, a symbol tied to pre-Christian cults, ancient rites, and the so-called golden calf of the Old Testament. It suggests that the church was originally dedicated to an older faith, a faith that predates Christianity. Today, that calf is gone, replaced by a pristine lamb, surrounded by saints, surrounded by Christian symbolism. The transformation is complete. What once was a testament to an older religion has been painstakingly reshaped into a Christian altar. This is not restoration. This is erasure. This is historical surgery. And if they were willing to alter altars, vases, statues, and ruins, what else did they alter? Which brings us back to Piranesi himself. For centuries, he has been portrayed as an eccentric, a dreamer, a fantasist. But fantasies do not require a team of highly trained draftsmen and engravers. Fantasies do not require industrial-scale workshops producing hundreds of plates. Fantasies do not require precise measurements, detailed machinery, and architectural logic. The man ran what amounted to a documentary studio, a preservation bureau, a last-ditch archive to save the memory of a world drowning in rubble, a world that someone wanted forgotten, a world that may have stretched from Rome to St. Petersburg, from the Mediterranean to the Baltic, connected by underground complexes, monumental squares, engineered canals, and standardized architectural symbolism, a world whose creators were not beardless Greeks or smooth-faced Romans, but people like the bearded warrior Piranesi sketched from an ancient statue, an image that does not match any classical ideal we see in museums today.
Where are their statues? Where are their monuments? Where are their faces in history? Gone, scrubbed, replaced. And Piranesi's engravings may be the last surviving record of them. So picture this, a world with giant underground infrastructures, cities with Egyptian, Greek, and Roman motifs, not separated by centuries, but existing simultaneously. A culture advanced enough to carve perfectly engineered stone vaults beneath entire districts. A global symbolic language repeated from Italy to Russia. A catastrophic event that wipes it all out, and a wave of ideological reconstruction in the 18th and 19th centuries that divides the unified memory into fragments. Egypt, Greece, Rome, Byzantium, slicing one mega-civilization into dozens of isolated narratives. And then one man walks into the ruins with a sketchbook. He sees the bodies still decaying. He sees the arches still cracked from the disaster. He sees the megastructures half buried. He sees altars not yet rewritten. He sees cities that historians would later claim never existed. He sees the blueprint, and he draws it. Not as fantasy, not as imagination, but as testimony. Because he knows that by the time the dust settles, nothing will remain. Nothing except his engravings. And so today we look at those engravings and see fantasy. But what if fantasy is simply truth we're not allowed to recognize? What if Piranesi was the last witness of a fallen world? The last chronicler of a civilization erased? The last recorder of a megacity that once connected continents? The last guardian of symbols that modern history desperately tried to bury? And now, after centuries of silence, those engravings speak again. The forbidden blueprint is still there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to understand. So ask yourself, was Piranesi a mad dreamer, or the final survivor of a truth we were never meant to know?